1.7 million casualties. That's how many soldiers, German and Soviet combined, fell fighting over a single salient in central Russia between January 1942 and March 1943. To put that in perspective, the entire American Civil War produced roughly 1.5 million casualties over 4 years. The Rzhev salient consumed more lives in 14 months. Yet most people have never heard of it. Stalingrad dominates the history books. Kursk gets the documentaries. But Rzhev, a battle that raged continuously for over a year, that ground entire armies into dust, that one Soviet veteran would later call the meat grinder, remains largely forgotten. The Soviets suppressed it because the losses were catastrophic and the gains were nil. Soviet commanders threw over 800,000 men and more than 2,000 tanks against German defenses in a single operation and failed completely. The Germans eventually abandoned the salient voluntarily in March 1943, making the entire 14-month defense seem pointless in retrospect. And Western historians, focused on the more dramatic turning points of the war, simply moved past it. For decades, Soviet veterans who survived Rzhev were discouraged from discussing their experiences. The battle contradicted the official narrative of inevitable Soviet victory through superior strategy. What happened at Rzhev was something uglier. Pure attritional grinding where numerical superiority couldn't overcome defensive mastery, where divisions evaporated in days, where the same hills changed hands a dozen times without either side gaining permanent advantage. But what happened at Rzhev matters. It reveals the brutal mathematics of attritional warfare on the Eastern Front. It demonstrates how defensive mastery could hold ground against overwhelming odds, and why holding that ground might ultimately be meaningless. And it introduces us to Walter Model, the German general who would become known as the Wehrmacht's fireman, a specialist in defensive warfare who built his reputation in the frozen forests northwest of Moscow. This is the story of the Rzhev salient, and it begins with a dagger pointed at the Soviet capital. If you're interested in how wars are actually decided by logistics, math, and doctrine, subscribe now, turn on notifications, and stay tuned for more in-depth World War II analysis. Let's continue. In January 1942, the Soviet winter counteroffensive at Moscow had driven German forces back across a broad front. The Wehrmacht retreated between 100 and 280 kilometers from the Soviet capital, reeling from its first major defeat of the war. Operation Barbarossa's promise of a quick victory had frozen to death in the Russian winter. Yet the withdrawal remained incomplete. Northwest of Moscow, German forces clung to a massive territorial bulge centered on the city of Rzhev. This salient jutted eastward into Soviet-held territory like a tumor that refused to be excised. The bulge stretched roughly 200 kilometers wide and protruded 160 kilometers into Soviet lines, a geographic anomaly that created both opportunity and vulnerability for both sides. Field Marshal Zhukov would characterize the position with stark precision. The German forces at Rzhev represented a dagger pointed at Moscow. The salient's formation resulted from the partial success of Soviet spearheads that had penetrated German lines during the winter battles. The Kalinin Front's 39th and 29th armies had driven deep into Wehrmacht positions, threatening to encircle substantial German forces. But the encirclement never closed. The German 9th Army found itself holding a bulge that defied the clean arrows on operational maps. A position that should have been untenable, yet somehow persisted. For the Wehrmacht, the Rzhev salient offered several strategic advantages that justified the cost of its defense. The position provided forward staging areas for a renewed offensive toward Moscow once German forces recovered from their winter setbacks. The elevated terrain around Rzhev dominated the surrounding landscape, offering observation posts and defensive strongpoints that could anchor an entire army. The salient also tied down substantial Soviet forces that might otherwise reinforce other sectors of the Eastern Front. For the Soviets, the bulge represented an unacceptable threat. German forces remained within striking distance of Moscow, positioned to exploit any weakening of Soviet defenses. The salient's existence demonstrated the incompleteness of the winter victory and provided the Wehrmacht with fortified positions from which to launch spoiling attacks against Soviet concentrations. The Bulge also bisected critical rail lines connecting Moscow with the northwestern regions of the Soviet Union, complicating supply and reinforcement operations. Neither side could afford to ignore this awkward protrusion. The Germans had to hold it or accept a strategic defeat. The Soviets had to eliminate it or accept a permanent threat to their capital. On January 12, 1942, the German High Command appointed General Walter Model to command the Ninth Army. Model's reputation as a defensive specialist preceded him. His task was to stabilize the salient's perimeter, transform temporary positions into fortified lines, and preserve the Wehrmacht's forward presence despite ongoing Soviet pressure. Model stepped from his staff car into Ninth Army headquarters, inheriting command of one of the Wehrmacht's most precarious positions. The exposed wedge stretching toward Moscow sprawled across 90 kilometers of frozen terrain where temperatures plunged below -30°C. Soviet forces from the Kalinin Front maintained relentless pressure against the German perimeter. The protrusion's boundaries remained fluid, rather than fortified, with units fighting to maintain cohesion against attacks that threatened to collapse the entire position. Model's first actions reflected his methodical nature. He demanded detailed reports from divisional commanders. He studied topographical maps identifying defensible terrain. He assessed the combat strength of formations battered by weeks of continuous winter warfare. The reality he observed contradicted the clean lines drawn on operational maps. German infantry divisions, depleted to 50% strength, held sectors designed for fully equipped formations. Supply lines stretched across partisan-infested territory where winter storms regularly severed road connections. Artillery ammunition stocks ran critically low, but Model understood something that would define his command. This assignment transcended mere defensive operations. He commanded a strategic anchor point whose retention shaped the entire Eastern Front's geometry. Abandoning the ground meant surrendering operational initiative and accepting a retreat that would expose Army Group Center's flanks to encirclement. Model's defensive doctrine emphasized economy of force, identifying which terrain must be held absolutely and which could be surrendered to preserve combat power. He ordered immediate reconnaissance of fallback positions, established mobile reserves from reconstituted units, and began transforming the chaotic perimeter into a coherent defensive system. The architecture of Model's defense would become his signature. Rather than establishing a thin forward line that could be punctured at any point, he created defensive zones with depth. Fortified villages served as anchors, their stone buildings reinforced with earth and timber, their cellars converted into command posts and ammunition bunkers. Between these strong points, infantry occupied trenches covered by interlocking machine gun fields of fire. Anti-tank guns were positioned not just at the forward edge but throughout the defensive zone, creating multiple belts that attacking armor would have to penetrate. Artillery batteries, carefully concealed and pre-registered on likely approach routes, could drop concentrations on any sector within minutes. The German position would not merely absorb Soviet attacks. It would channel them into killing zones where concentrated firepower offset numerical disadvantage. Every valley became a potential trap. Every tree line concealed positions that could fire into the flanks of advancing forces. The defensive specialist had inherited chaos and was forging it into a system. The first test came in March. Through February 1942, Soviet commanders studied the German salient, identifying vulnerabilities in the hastily drawn perimeter. The Kalinin Front, commanded by Colonel General Ivan Konev, concentrated two armies along the salient's northern shoulder. The 39th Army, under Lieutenant General Ivan Maslenikov, and the 29th Army under Lieutenant General Viktor Shvetsov. Intelligence indicated German positions remained incomplete, with gaps between strong points and limited tactical reserves. Stalin's Stavka directive authorized offensive operations to collapse the salient before spring thaw rendered operations impossible. On March 3, 1942, Soviet artillery opened preparatory bombardments across multiple sectors of the Rzhev perimeter. The 39th Army launched its main effort from positions northeast of the salient, driving toward Rzhev-Sychevka to sever German lateral communications. Infantry divisions advanced through snow-choked forests, attempting to infiltrate between German strongpoints rather than assault them directly. The 29th Army simultaneously attacked from the east, aiming to penetrate the salient's base and link with 39th Army forces in the German rear. The initial penetrations looked promising. Soviet forces pushed 15 to 20 kilometers through gaps that Model's forces had not yet closed. But Model's defensive system was designed precisely for this scenario. German defenders occupied fortified villages converted into all-around defense positions. Each strong point contained entrenched infantry, registered artillery support, and pre-sighted machine gun fields of fire covering approach routes. The defensive system relied on mutual support between positions separated by 2 to 4 kilometers, with mobile battle groups, Kampfgruppen built around assault guns and motorized infantry, positioned to counterattack penetrations. The key to Model's system lay in what happened when Soviet infantry bypassed strongpoints. Rather than abandoning their positions, German garrisons maintained their ground, interdicting supply lines and preventing exploitation. Soviet units that pushed forward found themselves in a nightmare scenario. Enemy forces in front, enemy forces behind, and their supply corridors under constant fire from positions they had supposedly passed. The Soviet 39th Army soon found itself in a precarious salient within the German salient, surrounded on 3 sides with a narrow supply corridor under constant interdiction. German counterattacks severed Soviet communications repeatedly, forcing resupply by airdrops that couldn't sustain combat operations. Transport aircraft faced concentrated flak approaching the shrinking pocket. What ammunition reached the trapped divisions wasn't enough to maintain offensive operations, yet the 39th Army couldn't withdraw through the same gauntlet it had penetrated. The 29th Army's supporting attacks failed to achieve significant penetration, leaving the 39th Army isolated and slowly starving. Through April, Soviet forces attempted to either widen the corridor or withdraw the army, achieving neither decisively. On April 20th, offensive operations officially concluded. The 39th Army remained encircled. The salient stood intact. Soviet casualties mounted without strategic gain. Model had held. But the trapped Soviet forces remained a problem, a pocket of enemy soldiers deep within German-controlled territory, supplied by sporadic aerial resupply, capable of disrupting German operations behind the front line. In early summer 1942, Model finalized plans for Operation Seydlitz, a deliberate offensive to crush the trapped Soviet pocket. The encircled force, comprising the remnants of the Soviet 39th Army and 11th Cavalry Corps, occupied a shrinking enclave sustained only by airdrops. Model's staff identified the operational weakness. These formations, though still combat-capable, depended entirely on aerial resupply for ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Interdiction fires from surrounding German positions already strangled ground movement between isolated Soviet strongholds. The German plan concentrated 6 divisions against the pocket's perimeter, creating overwhelming local superiority. Model's operational method emphasized deliberate preparation over hasty assault. Artillery was registered on known Soviet fortified villages. Assault groups rehearsed for close combat in wooded terrain. Supply stockpiles were positioned forward. The objective remained simple: systematic annihilation of the pocket through concentric pressure, collapsing the Soviet perimeter inward until organized resistance became impossible. Operation Seydlitz commenced on July 2, 1942. German infantry divisions advanced from multiple axes, their artillery preparation targeting Soviet command posts and ammunition depots identified through signal intelligence. The offensive represented Model's transition from defensive specialist to executioner. Rather than waiting for the pocket to wither, he intended to crush it systematically. The trapped force fought with desperate intensity, knowing encirclement offered no withdrawal routes. Soviet soldiers understood what capture meant on the Eastern Front. If the Germans didn't shoot prisoners outright, they would march them to camps where starvation and disease would accomplish the same end more slowly. Surrender wasn't an option for men who had nothing left to lose. Fortified villages changed hands repeatedly as Soviet commanders committed their dwindling reserves to hold critical terrain. German assault guns, Sturmgeschütz 3s with their low profiles and heavy frontal armor, reduced defensive positions methodically, their 75mm guns collapsing fieldworks that infantry couldn't storm directly. German infantry battled through heavily wooded sectors where artillery proved less effective, clearing trenches and bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers. By July 13th, 11 days of sustained combat had reduced the pocket to isolated strongpoints. Soviet ammunition stocks were exhausted. Communications collapsed as radio batteries died and telephone lines were cut. Casualty rates climbed beyond sustainable levels. Medics had nothing left to treat the wounded, no morphine for the dying. The encircled formations disintegrated as organized units, fragmenting into desperate groups seeking any escape from the tightening noose. Small groups from the 39th Army managed breakouts through gaps in German lines, fighting eastward towards Soviet positions. Remnants emerged from the forests northwest of Rzhev, moving in groups of 10 to 50 men, carrying wounded on improvised stretchers, their uniforms torn by barbed wire and undergrowth. They reached Red Army positions near Zubtsov with nothing but what they could carry. The trapped garrison had ceased to exist as an organized formation. But even as Model's offensive succeeded, the Soviets demonstrated they retained offensive capability. Red Army forces simultaneously recaptured Zubtsov on the same day the pocket collapsed, pushing German defenders back across destroyed bridges. The recapture demonstrated that the Kalinin front could still attack despite catastrophic losses. The operational balance sheet showed contradictions. Model had destroyed 2 Soviet armies and secured the salient's immediate approaches. German units now held terrain previously contested in brutal winter fighting. Supply routes into Rzhev no longer faced interdiction from surrounded divisions operating behind German lines. Yet the strategic situation remained unchanged. The salient persisted, defended by exhausted German forces who had demonstrated their ability to execute complex offensive operations, even while maintaining defensive positions across a 200-kilometer front. The Kalinin front's losses exceeded 100,000 men. 2 armies had been destroyed as combat formations. Soviet commanders faced the task of rebuilding shattered divisions while maintaining pressure on German positions. The town's liberation at Zubtsov provided a tactical success, but changed nothing fundamental. Rzhev remained in German hands. The dagger still pointed at Moscow, and Moscow was about to strike back. On July 30th, 1942, the Soviet Kalinin front launched what would become known as the First Rzhev-Sychevka offensive, a massive assault designed to finally eliminate the salient that had defied every previous attempt. At 0630 hours, Soviet artillery opened fire across the northern approaches to the Rzhev position. For 90 minutes, massed batteries pounded German defensive lines. 152mm gun howitzers hammered concrete bunkers and communication trenches while lighter field guns worked over forward positions. Behind this curtain of steel, the 30th Army's mobile group prepared to advance. 9 tank brigades, organized specifically for this offensive, assembled in their jumping-off positions. The concentration represented a significant commitment of armor, drawn from front reserves and rebuilt after the spring's failures. Each brigade carried T-34 medium tanks as their primary striking force. The plan called for deep penetration toward Rzhev itself, 17 kilometers to the south. At 0800 hours, the artillery preparation ceased. The tank brigades rolled forward through the morning haze. The Soviet plan relied on mass and momentum. The T-34 medium tank remained the most capable armored vehicle on the Eastern Front in 1942. Its sloped armor could deflect most German anti-tank rounds at range, and its 76mm gun could destroy any German tank then in service. Soviet commanders expected their armor to punch through the German defensive belt before infantry resistance could solidify, opening a corridor for exploitation forces to pour through toward Rzhev. The breakthrough force struck directly at positions held by the German 256th Infantry Division, a formation that had weathered Operation Seydlitz 2 weeks earlier, but now faced a concentrated armored thrust along a narrow front. The division's soldiers had barely recovered from the pocket reduction fighting when the Soviet blow fell. The German response exposed immediate friction in the Soviet plan. Model's 9th Army had spent the preceding weeks strengthening its defensive network across the Bulge, and the defenses reflected lessons learned from a year of Eastern Front combat. Anti-tank guns positioned in depth, not just along the forward line but throughout the defensive zone, began engaging Soviet armor at ranges where the T-34's gun struggled to suppress them effectively. The Germans had deployed Pa 40 75mm anti-tank guns, weapons specifically designed to defeat the T-34's armor, in concealed positions covering the approach routes. German artillery, pre-registered on likely avenue of advance, dropped concentrations on assembling Soviet infantry. The coordination between German arms, artillery, isolating infantry from armor, anti-tank guns engaging vehicles, machine guns cutting down dismounted troops, represented the refinement of defensive warfare that Model had spent months developing. The 256th Infantry Division's positions bent, but held coherence. By midday, Soviet tank units had penetrated the first German defensive belt, but at significant cost. Burning T-34s marked the advance routes. Infantry support, moving on foot through defended ground, lagged behind the armor. The gap between tank spearheads and supporting rifle units, a persistent problem in Soviet offensive operations, began to widen. German strongpoints bypassed in the initial rush now fired into the flanks of the advance, disrupting the flow of follow-on forces. The 30th Army continued pushing south through July 30th, gaining ground measured in hundreds of meters rather than kilometers. The offensive had achieved tactical surprise in timing, but the German defensive system at Rzhev, layered, mutually supporting, and commanded by a specialist in defensive warfare, was absorbing the blow. The next day would determine whether the defensive belt could be shattered entirely. In Part 2, we'll follow the Soviet breakthrough as it finally ruptures German lines, witness the devastating tank battles along the Rzhev-Sychevka rail line, and watch as the fighting descends into the suburban rubble of Rzhev itself. We'll see Zhukov's departure for Stalingrad, Konev's assumption of command, and the massive commitment of Operation Mars. 817,000 men and over 2,000 tanks thrown against Model's defenses in a desperate bid to eliminate the salient once and for all.